My name is Rebecca Hayes. At 46, I was once the youngest strategic officer in the Atlantic Fleet, the woman whose war map saved lives and whose silence carried more weight than any shout. Commanders twice my age studied my decisions like scripture, and for years I believed nothing could erase that legacy. But legacies can be buried in an instant, especially when the people holding the shovel are your own parents. I walked into the ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in Boston, the chandeliers blazing with gold light that made every glass sparkle. The scent of roasted meat and polished silver hung in the air. I told myself to keep my shoulders straight and my chin up, though the weight of my family's stares met me before I had even reached the table. My father, Thomas, 74 now, but still carrying the air of a man who enjoyed being the sharpest voice in any room, tapped his glass with a spoon. His words sliced clean through the chatter. Our Admiral died 12 years ago. The laughter that followed was not the polite kind it was, laughter that clung to me like smoke. Some people tried to smother their grins, others leaned forward with curiosity, but all of them looked at me. My mother Margaret sat with her back straight, folding her napkin like it mattered more than her daughter. She did not look at me, but her silence was heavy, a silence that permitted every other cruel smile around the table. Jonathan, my brother, 2 years older and the golden child of our family, leaned back in his chair and laughed with confidence. He lifted his wine, added just loud enough for the people nearest to hear. At least we all agree on that. His wife laughed along the sound brittle as glass. I lowered myself into the empty chair at the edge of the table. The scrape of the chair on marble made me wince. The servers swept by, placing plates of roast beef asparagus gleaming with glaze and potatoes sculpted into perfect ovals. I stared down at the food, my hand tight around the water glass. My knuckles turned white as I forced myself to take a sip. The metal taste of humiliation spread across my tongue. My mother finally lifted her eyes. She did not frown, did not soften, just gave me that look she had given me since childhood. It was the look that meant, stay quiet. Do not shame us, take your place. Her silence was louder than my father's taunt. I wanted to shout that I had not died, that once I commanded fleets, and now I could not even command respect at my own family's table. But my voice would not rise. The quartet played in the corner, the music rich and smooth, mocking me with its elegance. I kept my face calm, though my chest was on fire. Guests shifted in their seats, pretending not to notice, but I caught fragments of whispers. Isn't that the one who lost her post? I felt every word like a needle. Jonathan smiled, satisfied, sipping his wine, as if this humiliation was a toast in his honor. Then my eyes met Emily's. She sat across from me, Jonathan's daughter, 12 years old, her hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes flicked from her father to me, unsettled, as if she could not understand why the room had turned so cold. When she looked at me, I saw not pity, but something deeper, a question, maybe even a plea. Her gaze was steady, in a way no adult dared to be. For a heartbeat, the laughter around me blurred. The clinking glasses faded. All I saw was her. In her eyes, I found a flicker of warmth I had forgotten existed, a reminder that I was not as invisible as they wanted me to believe. I set down my glass carefully and lifted my chin. I felt the cold in my chest harden into steel. Their laughter still echoed, but it no longer owned me. I could taste the silence inside me sharpening, cutting, preparing. They thought their words were final, but I knew this night was only the beginning, and they had no idea what was about to come. I remember the year 2013 more vividly than I wish I did. The air in Norfolk had been heavy with salt and smoke, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every decision feel like it carries the weight of history. I was stationed with the Atlantic Fleet, 44 vessels scattered across contested waters, and I had been the one asked to draw the line. My strategy was simple, defensive, meant to shield our destroyers while giving our carriers enough room to maneuver. It was the kind of move that looked cautious on paper but saved lives in practice. For a moment, I thought I had done the right thing, but politics has a way of rewriting outcomes. Senator Richard Coleman, a man with a smile made for television and a hunger for headlines, seized on a single statistic. He stood before the cameras in Washington and painted my decision as cowardice, saying that I had hesitated, that my delay had cost the Navy its chance at victory. The truth was far from his words, but truth rarely makes the evening news. Overnight, the story shifted. I was no longer a strategist with a record of success. I was the woman who flinched when the country needed strength. The Navy responded with silence. They placed me on administrative leave, my files sealed, my clearance suspended. I sat in a sterile office as an officer, slid the papers across the desk, his eyes refusing to meet mine. Effective immediately. That phrase has a way of stealing the air from your lungs. I had worn that uniform for 2 decades, and in one meeting, it was as if none of it had happened. I went home to Boston thinking my family might at least offer a word of comfort. Instead, my father poured himself a drink and said that maybe I should have thought harder before stepping into battles I could not win. My mother's silence was worse. She moved around the kitchen arranging plates as if the shame that clung to me might stain the silverware. Jonathan smiled thinly and said he was glad at least one of us was not embarrassing the Hayes name. Within months, he had stepped into the CEO role at Hayes Real Estate Group, our family's pride shaking hands with investors as if he were the legacy worth celebrating. The press did not let go easily. Articles painted me as reckless commentators on late-night shows smirked at my name, and the photo of me standing in uniform at a press briefing became the backdrop for jokes about failure. I clipped those articles and kept them in a folder, not because I wanted reminders, but because I needed proof that the world could lie with a straight face. The Board for Correction of Naval Records received petitions from allies, but the paperwork seemed to vanish into some locked drawer. Weeks bled into months, months into years, and the stain never lifted. At gatherings, I noticed how people's smiles tightened when I entered the room. Old friends avoided the subject, but the silence told me everything. To the public, the senator's words had become fact. To my family, they were ammunition. Every holiday dinner, every conversation, Jonathan's achievements were paraded like medals, while my service was spoken of as a cautionary tale. I kept working in smaller ways, teaching strategy to cadets in private seminars, consulting quietly for firms that valued discretion. But the truth never surfaced. The official record sat frozen, and with it, my career. That night in the ballroom when my father mocked me, it was not just his words echoing. It was a decade of headlines, jokes, and whispered conversations folded into one sharp sentence. Our Admiral died 12 years ago. He knew exactly which scar to press. Emily's eyes lingered on me even then, and I wondered if she had ever searched my name online, if she had ever read the stories that painted me as less than I was. She was too young to remember 2013, but old enough to sense that something had been taken from me. I sat in that ballroom with their laughter filling the air, and all I could think of was the folder of clippings hidden in my apartment, the documents that told a story no one wanted to hear. I knew that if the truth ever surfaced, it would not only clear my name, it would unravel the careful lies my family had built around Jonathan. And that thought was enough to make me breathe differently, as if the weight pressing down on me was shifting. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and their laughter dulled into background noise. I kept my smile faint, hiding the storm that was stirring inside me. They believed the past was buried forever. What they did not know was that the past was beginning to move again, and it was moving straight toward us. I stayed quiet through the rest of that dinner, smiling when I had to lifting my glass when expected, but inside I was listening. My family had a habit of speaking freely when they thought I was invisible, and years of silence had made me good at catching every word not meant for me. Later that night, as the party drifted into smaller conversations and the quartet softened to background noise, I slipped down a side corridor lined with portraits of long-dead donors. My heels tapped lightly against the marble floor as I followed the murmur of voices to a smaller lounge just off the ballroom. I froze when I recognized my mother's voice. She was seated close to the fireplace, with Jonathan leaning toward her, his expression taut with calculation. I stayed in the shadows, their reflections flickering on the polished brass. Margaret's tone was clipped. "We need to finalize the papers. Jonathan will inherit everything. It is time to remove Rebecca from the trust. Jonathan nodded with satisfaction. She has nothing to offer this family anymore. The sooner we make it official, the better. The words settled heavy in my chest, thicker than the smoke curling from the fire. They were not just laughing at my past, they were planning to erase my future. My hands curled into fists as I held my breath, careful not to make a sound. The door creaked behind me, and I turned quickly. Emily stood there, her small frame tense, her eyes wide with something she had overheard. She whispered so softly, I almost missed it. Aunt Rebecca, if they take everything, where will you go? My throat closed. I bent down, placing my hands gently on her shoulders. Do not worry about me, sweetheart, I said, though the lie tasted bitter. She nodded, trusting, then slipped back toward the hallway, leaving me alone with my pulse hammering in my ears. I could not sleep when I returned to my apartment that night. The city lights of Boston glowed through the blinds, restless and cold. I pulled out the old folder I had kept for years, the one filled with articles, transcripts, and every clipped headline about my so-called failure. I spread the papers across the dining table until it was covered in black ink and shame. My eyes scanned each line, searching for patterns for names. That was when I found a memorandum buried in a stack of financial documents I had obtained through a friend years earlier. It detailed a partnership between Jonathan's company, Hayes Real Estate Group, and a shell corporation linked to Senator Coleman. The project described was a land acquisition worth hundreds of millions, its legitimacy bolstered by Coleman's public standing and Jonathan's promise of family reputation. There was a signature block at the bottom, Jonathan's name, bold and certain, next to Coleman's neat cursive. My stomach tightened as I realized the connection. The senator who had destroyed my career had not just slandered me in 2013. He had built his fortunes alongside my own brother. I leaned back in the chair, my heart racing. The ink on the page seemed to pulse under the dim light. If this deal went through, Jonathan would not only inherit the family trust, he would control a fortune tied to Coleman's network. And with my name stripped from the records, I would be erased not just from my family's table, but from every ledger that counted. The anger in me sharpened, steady and precise. I slid the documents back into the folder and closed it with deliberate care. The sound of the latch clicking felt like a promise. For the first time in years, I was not just remembering the past. I was holding evidence of a present conspiracy, one that tied together my family's betrayal and the senator's lies. I stood by the window watching the dark water of the Charles River shimmer under city lights. My reflections stared back, tired but unbroken. They thought I was finished, but what I had in my hands was proof strong enough to crack the foundation they had built. And I knew then that the next move would not belong to them. It would belong to me. The call came just after dawn, while the city was still quiet, the kind of silence that makes every sound sharper. I had barely slept, the folder of documents still spread across my table, when my phone vibrated. The name on the screen made me sit up straighter. It was Daniel Price, a lieutenant I had trained years ago, now serving in the Pentagon. His voice carried a mix of nerves and excitement. Rebecca, I thought you should know the Department of the Navy just declassified records from 2013. Your strategy was confirmed as the correct course of action. The review board cited it as an example of calculated defense that prevented escalation. You were right all along. The words landed heavy and light at once. For 12 years, I had carried the weight of a lie, and now truth was stepping into daylight. Before I could answer, another call came through. I stared at the screen. Michael Grant. He had been a commander, then sharp, decisive, one of the few who never doubted me. I answered with a steady voice, though my hands trembled. He spoke without hesitation. Rebecca, there is a gala this weekend in Washington honoring strategic contributions to the Navy. I want you there. I have something to give you, something that belongs in your hands. I swallowed hard. The city outside suddenly too bright. What is it? I asked, though part of me already knew. His reply was firm. A decision letter from the Board for Correction of Naval Records. Your DD-214 has been amended. Effective immediately, your record shows reinstatement with honor. The silence that followed seemed to stretch. I pressed my palm against the cool surface of the table, grounding myself. After years of being branded as a failure, the Navy itself was correcting the record. That night I sat alone with the envelope Grant had sent by courier, the seal crisp and official. My name stood in bold letters, the language precise. Administrative leave rescinded, service record corrected. Eligible for appointment to the Strategic Maritime Council. I traced the embossed crest with my fingertips, my breath catching as though I had been underwater for years, and finally surfaced. Yet as the joy rose in me, doubt shadowed it. I thought of my father's mocking voice, my mother's silence, Jonathan's smirk. To them the stain had been truth for over a decade. Even if I held this paper in front of their eyes, would it matter? Or would they dismiss it the way they had dismissed me, twisting it into another weakness? I stood by the window, the city lights flickering against the glass, and weighed the paper in my hand. It was more than words. It was a sword sharp enough to cut through the lies that had wrapped around me. But a sword unsheathed draws blood, and I knew that once I used it, there would be no going back. The night of the gala drew closer. I pressed the letter back into its envelope and slid it into my bag, feeling its weight with every step. My phone buzzed again this time, with a message from Grant. "Do not hide, Rebecca. This is yours. They cannot take it away again." I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between silence and revelation. My mind replayed Emily's wide eyes at the dinner, her whispered question of where I would go if they took everything. The thought of her growing up believing her family's lies ignited something I could not quiet. By dawn, I knew the choice would come not in the privacy of my apartment, but in a room filled with witnesses. I closed my eyes, clutching the envelope to my chest. The next time I opened it, the world would know whether I was ready to stand in the light or disappear again. I drove back to the old Hayes house in Brookline the next afternoon, the envelope still hidden in my bag. The streets were lined with trees stripped bare by winter, the same streets I had ridden my bike down as a girl. The house itself looked the same red brick with white shutters, though the windows seemed colder now, the warmth long gone. I told myself I was only visiting to drop off a forgotten gift from the dinner, but the truth was that I needed to know what they were planning. The front door was unlocked, as it always had been when family was expected. Voices carried down the hallway low and deliberate, and I paused just before the archway to the sitting room. My father's tone was firm, the same voice that had commanded lecture halls for decades. "After the gala, we announce it formally. Jonathan will be the sole heir. It is time to cut her out completely." My chest tightened. For a moment I thought I had misheard, but then my mother spoke, her voice sharp and cool. "Rebecca is only a shadow now. Keeping her in the trust only adds shame to our name. She belongs outside of it." Jonathan agreed easily, almost casually, as though my life could be erased with a signature. "The papers are ready. All we need is the right moment." I pressed myself against the wall, my phone already in my hand. My thumb slid across the screen, and the recorder blinked to life. Every word spilled into the device, each sentence another thread in the net they were weaving around me. Margaret laughed softly, the sound brittle. "She has lived long enough off our patience. When the guests hear she is gone, they will only nod. No one will question it." Jonathan answered with the smugness that had always come so naturally to him. "It is the only way forward. With the land deal moving with Senator Coleman backing me, we cannot afford her name on anything." My heart pounded in my ears, not just from anger but from clarity. This was not neglect. It was not favoritism. It was a deliberate plan, organized in time to erase me from every page of this family's legacy. The fireplace crackled, masking the sharp inhale I could not suppress. For a moment I thought they had heard me, but the conversation continued. My father poured another drink. "The gala will be perfect. Coleman will make his statement. By the end of the night, Rebecca will be nothing more than a memory." I backed away slowly, every step measured, so the wood floor would not creak. Once outside, I filled my lungs with the freezing air, clutching the phone in my hand like it was the only weapon I had. The recording was proof. For the first time in years, their contempt was no longer just an atmosphere. It was evidence. I sat in my car with the engine off, listening to the playback. Each word rang sharp, undeniable. My mother's cold dismissal, my father's calculation, Jonathan's confidence, Coleman's name. The knot in my stomach unraveled into something stronger, something steadier. They thought they could erase me quietly, that I would simply fade, but I had their plan in my pocket. I looked back at the house one last time, its windows glowing with the comfort of a family that had never included me. My reflection in the windshield looked different now, sharper, harder. They had made me into their enemy, and I had finally accepted the role. As I drove away, the envelope with the Navy seal shifted in my bag beside the phone, the two pieces of evidence pressing against each other. One proved who I had always been. The other proved what they had always done. Together, they were enough to change everything, and the gala would no longer be their stage alone. The ballroom in Washington was larger than I remembered, the ceiling glittering with crystal lights, every table lined with navy blue cloth, and silver centerpieces shaped like anchors. The air carried the low hum of 100 conversations, but none of them were kind when it came to me. I felt the weight of eyes on my back as I walked to my assigned seat at the edge of the room. People whispered, some hiding their words behind glasses, others bold enough to let me hear. That is the one who failed. That is the reason she was cut off. My father sat 2 tables closer to the stage, his posture straight, his glass already half empty. He caught my eye only to smirk before turning back to a group of guests. My mother leaned toward another woman, speaking softly, but her glance at me was sharp as glass. Jonathan looked entirely at ease, greeting businessmen and shaking hands as if the night were his coronation. I lowered into my chair, smoothing the folds of my dress with steady hands, though my heart pressed hard against my ribs. Emily sat beside her father, her face half hidden behind the glow of the centerpiece candle. When our eyes met, she held my gaze longer than expected. There was no laughter in her look, no cruelty, only a quiet hope that made my throat tighten. The program began, speeches flowing easily, applause rising and falling in waves. I heard none of it. I felt the envelope in my bag like a stone, the recorder in my pocket like fire. My hands rested in my lap, but inside, every nerve was braced. Jonathan spoke briefly on stage about his company's role in supporting veterans, words that tasted false even from where I sat. Applause filled the room, and I saw the pride on my parents' faces. Minutes dragged like hours, the weight of waiting pressing down. Then the master of ceremonies cleared his throat, his voice rising above the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the delegation from the United States Navy." The room hushed instantly. The double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Footsteps echoed against the marble floor, measured and precise. Commander Michael Grant entered in full dress uniform, the ribbons on his chest catching the light. The air shifted as if the entire room inhaled at once. Conversations stopped. Glasses lowered. Even Jonathan straightened in his seat, his smile faltering just slightly. I felt my pulse quicken, each beat loud in my ears. My fingers curled against the tablecloth, and before I could stop myself, I rose to my feet. The scrape of the chair was sharp, breaking the silence. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, surprise etched on their faces. My chest tightened, but my eyes did not waver. I stood tall, my chin lifted, facing the stage and the long aisle that cut through the tables. My father's smirk vanished, replaced with confusion. My mother's hand froze on her glass. Emily's eyes widened, shining with something I had not seen in years, something close to pride. Grant's gaze found me across the room. He did not smile, but his stride never faltered. Every step echoed like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate, carrying the weight of the moment. My heart pounded in rhythm, but my resolve held firm. The ballroom that had been filled with whispers now held only silence, the kind of silence that bends the air and makes every breath feel like thunder. I felt their stares, the judgment, the disbelief, but also the anticipation. They wanted to see me falter again, to bow my head and vanish. Instead, I stood my ground, shoulders back, eyes locked on the man who carried the truth in his hands. The space between us closed, and with each step he took, the balance in the room shifted. They had mocked me for years, dismissed me, buried me under lies. Now the truth was walking toward me in polished shoes and a uniform that carried more weight than all their laughter combined. By the time he reached the center of the ballroom, I knew the moment I had waited for was no longer in the future. It was here, and there was no turning back. Commander Grant stopped directly in front of me, the weight of his presence pressing against the silence of the entire ballroom. He drew himself to full-height heels clicking together and raised his hand in a precise salute. His voice cut through the hush with absolute clarity. Admiral Hayes. The title landed in the air like a bell, sharp and undeniable. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some gasped, others exchanged quick glances, and the cameras of phones lifted in unison. My chest tightened, my throat burned, but I met his eyes and returned the salute, my hand steady, despite the storm inside me. Grant lowered his arm and reached into the folder he carried. The crisp sound of paper against leather echoed in the stillness. He read with measured cadence, his voice firm enough to carry to every corner of the hall. By decision of the Board for Correction of Naval Records, the record of Rebecca Hayes is hereby amended. Administrative leave rescinded, service recognized with honor. Service. Effective immediately, reinstated, and appointed to the United States Strategic Maritime Council. The applause did not come. Not yet. The room sat frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. My father's face drained of color, his glass tipping slightly as if his hand had forgotten how to hold it. My mother pressed her lips into a thin line, eyes darting toward the crowd, as if to gauge how much damage had been done. Jonathan shifted in his chair, his smile collapsing. His jaw clenched so tight, I thought it might break. A woman at a nearby table lifted her phone higher, recording with wide eyes. Then another followed, and soon half the room held cameras, lenses pointed at me, capturing every second. The light from the screens glowed like stars in the dim ballroom, proof that this moment would not remain contained within these walls. Jonathan shot to his feet, his voice low but urgent. "This is a mistake," he said, reaching toward Grant. "She has no place here." Grant's stare was unflinching. "The decision is final." He handed me the envelope, its seal unbroken, and turned slightly so that everyone could see. "The Navy has spoken." Jonathan's hand hung in the air before he withdrew it, fury darkening his face. He turned to the guests, searching for support, but their expressions betrayed him. Curiosity, shock, and the cold hunger of gossip stared back at him. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. Then, from the edge of the table, Emily stood. She moved around her father without hesitation, her small frame determined as she crossed the floor. The room parted in silence, eyes following her as she reached me. Without a word, she threw her arms around my waist, her face pressed against me. I felt her trembling, and then I realized the trembling was my own. A murmur rippled through the hall, not laughter, not ridicule, but something softer. It swelled the silence, breaking at last. Applause erupted, scattered at first, then rolling louder until it filled the room. I held Emily close, my hand against her back, my chin lifted. For the first time in over a decade, I was not defending myself. I was standing in truth, and the world was watching. My father looked away, shame etched into his profile. My mother adjusted her pearls with shaking hands. Jonathan sat down heavily, his eyes dark with calculation, but his power had already begun to crumble. The applause grew louder, people rising to their feet, the glow of their phones recording every detail that would flood the world by morning. I looked down at Emily, her eyes shining, and for a fleeting second, I saw myself reflected there, not as a failure, not as a shadow, but as something stronger than their lies. I knew the fight was not finished. This was only the strike that opened the wound. What came after would cut even deeper because Jonathan and Coleman still had cards left to play, and they would not surrender quietly. The applause faded into a heavy silence that felt almost sacred. I stood there with Emily still wrapped around me, her small arms holding tighter, as if she knew the world had just shifted. My father stared down at the tablecloth, the lines of his face sagging with something he could not disguise. My mother kept her chin high, but her eyes betrayed her darting left and right as though she could find a corner to hide in. Jonathan's expression was carved in stone fury beneath the surface, but his voice had deserted him. Across the room, someone whispered Coleman's name. Another followed with the word, investigation. The murmurs spread like sparks across dry grass. Phones were already buzzing messages, flying the weight of truth moving faster than lies ever had. By the time the night ended, every clip, every word would be circling through Boston and Washington alike. Commander Grant placed the envelope firmly into my hand. The paper felt warm from his grip, heavier than any metal I'd ever carried. He inclined his head slightly and stepped aside, allowing the attention to settle fully on me. I looked across the faces, seeing shocked curiosity, and in some corners, respect. What I did not see was doubt. Jonathan tried once more, pushing himself to his feet, his voice tight. "This is not over," he hissed, but the applause drowned him out. Guests turned their backs on him, some lifting their phones higher, capturing the sight of the golden sun exposed. He sat back down hard, his daughter still clinging to me, her trust placed not in him, but in the ant they had tried to erase. The rest unfolded quickly. By the following morning, headlines were filled with Coleman's name linked to fraudulent contracts and backroom deals. Jonathan's partnership with him was dragged into the light, the project they had boasted about suspended under review. The family legacy that had been built on exclusion and arrogance began to crumble, not with an explosion, but with the steady erosion of public truth. I did not gloat. I did not need to. Watching them lower their eyes, seeing the sheen of shame spread across faces that had only known superiority, was enough. My silence did the work for me. It spoke louder than any confrontation could. Emily squeezed my hand as we walked out together, the ballroom behind us, still buzzing with aftershocks. She looked up at me with eyes bright and certain. "Aunt Rebecca?" she said softly. "You showed them." I smiled, not at the victory, but at the certainty in her voice. In her gaze I saw something I had long forgotten, the possibility that legacy is not what others decide, but what you choose to pass forward. Outside, the night air was cool, the city glowing with restless light. Commander Grant waited by the door, his presence solid, his expression calm. He did not need to speak. The gesture of walking beside me was enough. Together we stepped into the waiting car, the envelope safe in my hand, Emily's promise echoing in my chest. I leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly. Justice had come late, but it had come. Honor once stolen was restored, and in that restoration, I found peace sharper and deeper than triumph. Their laughter no longer mattered. It would never drown me again. As the car pulled into the street, I thought of every person who had ever been silenced by family, diminished by lies, erased by those who claimed to love them. I thought of how truth once given voice could not be buried again. And I wondered how many others had been forced to carry that same weight in silence, waiting for their moment to stand. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family, only to prove them wrong in a way they never saw coming? Tell me what that moment was for you.